Viraj, as the
Yeah.
Australia AAERI Nepal chapter president, would you welcome His Excellency Peter Budd?
Okay. Thanks, Ravi. Good afternoon, all. Happy to be back again. I'm quite excited that in this AAERI convention, Australian Ambassador to Nepal, Honorable Peter Budd, has agreed to speak to the virtual crowd. Mr. Budd has been a great inspiration, supporter of AAERI Nepal since its inception, unconditionally. Mr. Budd is a career officer of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Before assuming his posting as the ambassador to Nepal in April 2017, Mr. Budd had most recently returned from a posting to Baghdad as DHOM 2012-2015. Mr. Budd has served as DHOM in Pretoria in 2009 and 12, and Port Vila in 2003 and 2006. He has also completed a posting in Yangon. In Canberra, Mr. Budd has worked in the Pacific Regional and Consular branches. His roles have included working with Pacific nations of the department, initiated PACERS Plus negotiations, and delivering the first iterations of the Department of Smart Travelers campaign. Mr. Budd holds a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Melbourne. He is married with 2 children. Over to you, Mr. Budd.
Thanks, Duraj, and thanks, Ravi, for inviting me along today to discuss this roadmap to recovery. I had a few minutes just to listen to the previous interaction, and it certainly does speak to the agility that's required for businesses, for institutions. So I really do appreciate being offered the opportunity to speak from the Nepal Australia perspective. I'd also like to acknowledge too AAERI's ongoing contribution to international education and your advice that you're delivering to government to inform our policy settings as we manage our way through COVID. That said, the nature of COVID and the uncertainties, there's going to be no perfect policy settings. We're all learning as we go. I'm not sure anyone initially that anticipated that we'd still be where we are today. So that really has spoken to the necessity of business sector, institutions, and all of us to be increasingly agile and flexible. And the importance for us still to work together for the sake of the students, the international education sector more broadly, and ultimately the recovery of our two nations. But thankfully, we've been during my almost 3.5 years as Australian Ambassador to Nepal, education has provided an extremely important ballast to the Australian-Nepal relationship and our burgeoning people-to-people links. Look, much has been said about Australia as an attractive destination for Nepalis to live, work and study. I understand that the Non-Resident Nepal Association in Australia estimates the diaspora in Australia to be more than 100,000, and Nepalis obviously remain one of the Nepali students studying in Australia. Now, there are a few reasons for this. We hope that Nepalis are attracted by the high calibre of Australian educational institutions, the promise of an internationally transferable qualification, and a visa regime that permits 20 hours of study a week, which is, I think, a pull factor there. Further, Australia's visa regime provides the opportunity for Nepalis to work for 2 years after completion of studies, so that when they return home, they have work experience to complement their qualification, which helps them make them more attractive to potential employers, or provides experience and know-how to enable them to start their own businesses. And I think we also need to recognise the strong sense of community is another pull factor. It seems that everyone, and every Nepali knows someone, a friend, or family member who's either studying or has chosen to live in cities. The chances are that you'll hear Nepali being spoken. So we recognise Nepali students studying in Australia make an extremely valuable contribution to Australian society, and their welfare is very important to us. And I think, the Nepali personality has also proven a really good fit when it comes to assimilating into Australian society as students. I think our shared ethnic and cultural diversity, our love of good food and music, our shared appreciation of the great outdoors and environment. And I think, and I suppose, and Australian courses will still remain good value for money. From a personal perspective, where the Australian dollar is at the moment, it's particularly probably good value for money. And apart from the currency, I think when we get to the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic, all these basic fundamentals for why Australian education is attractive will remain unchanged. And I think that's why the theme of this convention, Roadmap to Recovery, is so pertinent. Planning is necessary so that we are prepared whenever we can to maintain the sustainable growth of the education sector, and to provide opportunities for Nepalis to study, secure their futures, and through their global experience become leaders to advance Nepal's development if they choose, or to be leaders elsewhere. But COVID-19 has necessitated Australian educational institutions, as I was hearing in the previous session, to adapt and change the way they deliver course content. I mean, in the absence of face-to-face learning, institutions have had to pivot to the virtual realm, and they've done that pretty successfully. I mean, that doesn't meet a lot of the interests of specific to Nepali students. But, in terms of Australian innovation and having to adapt to the disruption of COVID-19, I think our Australian institutions have really walked the talk. And what this means is that even those students studying offshore, they're receiving the same learning experience as present as those in Australia, including, I must say, my own children are both studying at UTS online. So I've seen figures that suggest there are about 1,600 Nepali students offshore who are looking to return to Australia when it's safe to do so. I've spoken directly to these students on forums such as this. We recognise their frustrations, and we want to provide assurance that the Australian government is doing all it can within our COVID-19 safe framework to get you all back as soon as possible. And across governments in Australia, planning is well underway on the conditions that will allow the full return of international students, but unfortunately we're not quite there. We've seen the experience in Victoria and its efforts to manage a new wave of COVID-19 infections, just how infectious and insidious this disease is, and the complications it delivers for us trying to deliver a policy. And so it's highlighted the continuing uncertainties around COVID, which is why there can be no fixed timeline for the full return of international students, at least not yet. But Australia's educational system and the strong collaboration that exists between government and our educational institutions and education agency sector has ensured that Australia's maintained a consistent reputation for having among the strongest international support systems in the world, whether it be our tuition protection service or the consistent focus of the Australian government and our institutions on the welfare of our international students. I think navigating COVID-19 has required us to bolster this further. And I know a lot of this has been covered yesterday by Barry, our High Commissioner in New Delhi, but given that we may be having a slightly different audience, I'll just repeat some of this. For existing students, an estimated 1.3 billion has been pledged by the federal, state and territory governments in Australia, alongside education providers and the broader community to support international students during the COVID-19 crisis. So this includes through welfare services, financial assistance, mental health support, and emergency relief initiatives. Support's also being delivered by students themselves through their own associations and networks across Australia. For prospective students who are just beginning their journey, and I was quite heartened to just hear about those Google searches that suggest that searches on Australian education remain unchanged. We've also introduced new course search functions as well. There are also free masterclasses on the hub that you can view and participate in to give a taste of what Australian education offers. And these initiatives will help students and their families begin their journey of study in Australia. Obviously, we recognise the significant disruptions caused by COVID-19 in Nepal. I mean, national lockdowns, office closures and restrictions on public movement, which have disrupted the visa facilitation process. So in light of this, the Australian government has introduced flexible visa arrangements to assist current and prospective students. For students whose visas are about to expire, Australian legislation dictates that visas cannot be extended once granted. So applicants simply need to reapply and select a visa that accords with their travel intentions. For students who are unable to finish their study for reasons related to COVID-19, they'll be eligible for a free student visa to complete their study and will be able to apply online, as I understand, from late September. Graduates who held a student visa will be eligible to apply for a post-study work visa from outside Australia, and online study will count towards post-study work visa requirements. So that's how we're trying to adapt our visa regime to reflect some of the disruptions that have occurred, and I'd encourage students to refer to the Home Affairs website and the Study in Australia websites for the most up-to-date information on that. For Nepali students in Australia, flexible visa measures have also included extending student working hours in sectors critical to Australia's COVID-19 response. That includes within the disability services and aged care sectors. And it highlights how we value the contribution of our international students that they make to the broader Australian community in this difficult time. And with the Australian government recommencing the granting of student visas lodged outside Australia, this means when our borders eventually reopen, students will already have visas and be able to make arrangements to travel. I'm aware, most people will have seen the Australian government's also carefully considering pilot projects for international students to return to Australian universities. Our Prime Minister's roadmap to a COVID-safe Australia makes clear the government supports the return of international students to Australia, but in a COVID-safe environment. Now, by necessity, these pilots will be small scale. They're going to be led by state and territory governments in partnership with education institutions, and robust health, quarantine, border and provider protocols will be in place when they can occur. And I think we all hope that these pilots will pave the way for the return of all international students to Australia when it's safe to do so. And towards this end, the Australian government's working with states and territories on arrangements. And it's important we remember circumstances across Australia, as we've seen in Victoria, are subject to change, consistent with advice from our health authorities. And states and territories will also need to consider all of this in the design and implementation of their pilots. But it is intended that the pilots will provide that assurance to our international students whose studying lives have been severely disrupted by the pandemic that we are working towards their return. And from a personal and professional perspective, I'd obviously love to have Nepali students as part of any pilot return, but there are no guarantees because there are just so many moving parts. I mean, beyond the continuing uncertainties of COVID and the protection of public health, there is that necessary ongoing work between Australia's federal, state and territory governments and the education institutions, as I said. There's the availability or absence of international flights. And then there's also the Nepal government's own policy settings. And it's only been this week that the Nepal government has announced the planned resumption of international flights, with details being finalised on approved carriers and destinations. There remain COVID-19 prohibition orders in some 40 districts across Nepal, including the Kathmandu Valley. These have just been extended to, I think, midnight on the 1st or 2nd of September, as I understand. And then there's the question around no objection certificates and approvals for Nepalis to undertake overseas study. So the combination of these moving parts suggests there's insufficient certainty to plan a pilot just yet for Nepalis. That said, at some point we will get through to the other side of COVID-19, and we look forward to welcoming back our Nepali students. And when that time comes, and despite the impact of COVID-19 on the industry, I think Nepalis can be assured that Australia will not be compromising on integrity or quality, nor the standards that we set with respect to English language proficiency or educational financial requirements for a visa. And we will be relying on AAERI and other reputable education service providers to maintain our existing high standards. Simply that's because we want to ensure that all Nepalis, if they're prepared to invest in a quality Australian education, they are given the very best chance to succeed, and that's what we all hope and anticipate. And so on that final note, I hope you or your families, friends remain safe and well wherever they are, and I'm happy to take questions.
Ambassador Peter, this is Ravi here. And of course, at this point of time, normally each year I tend to meet you in Kathmandu. This time we are meeting, I'm in Sydney and you are in Kathmandu at this point of time. Just a very simple question. I mean, yesterday the High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell made a similar presentation where he talked about the challenges before the students stranded in the home country wanting to return to Australia to continue with their education. He talked about 6,000 odd Indian students, and today you are indicating 1,600 Nepalese students who might be currently in Nepal and wanting to return back to Australia. You also mentioned that you've been talking to these students in virtual platforms such as this. What have you been telling them? Have you told them that they'll be able to go back in 6 months or 12 months? Because we really don't know.
That's the thing. Yeah, and they've been asking you, when can we come back? And unfortunately, we haven't been in a position to put a timeline on it. I think, for example, Victoria was in the mix for one of these pilot projects, and then just the resurgence of COVID-19 occurred, and I mean, there's no international flights even entering Melbourne now. So I think it's all I could say to the students is that, we are absolutely working towards your return, but until we get a handle on COVID-19, we're unable to give any guarantees on time frames. So and just to maintain. Yep.
I totally take your point, and this is the challenge before all of us as education agents when we talk to students who are searching for Australian education options as to what to really tell them. Now, one of the things that we noticed in the last few months is the incredible amount of work that you did in terms of bringing back stranded Nepal Airlines to fly into Australia for the first time, bringing those stranded Australians. We would need something like that to bring our Nepalese students back from the 1,600 Nepalese students stranded there to somehow reach Australia. And this is where we need something to happen, because honestly speaking, the pipeline is not going to continue to stay on. We can't ask the students to defer indefinitely. And there will need to be a time for some political thought process to come into place, whether it is a quarantine-linked travel, maybe after 2 months, maybe after Victorian situation is brought under control. Students boarding a Nepal Airlines charter flight arriving in Sydney directly. Because one of the reasons why Barry mentioned yesterday that India will not be part of any pilot travel is because of some bilateral travel arrangements and because the students were required to travel through Malaysia or Singapore. But I mean, you've been able to bring the students directly from Nepal to here, and we will need to bring them again.
Yeah, look, and I have to say that whole Nepal Airlines story has been one positive that we've been able to draw out of the pandemic, that, you know, we've now got a proof of concept for direct flights from Nepal to Australia. But that's still a little way down the track. I mean, yeah, we were successful in getting a lot of Australians, thanks to Nepal Airlines, back home, but we've still got Australians stranded here. There's so many Australians still stranded in India as well, that due to passenger caps, that we're still not even able to get our own citizens home. So there's elements of that are going to have to be managed as well. And so we're looking at all options. You know, there's going to have to be a spread of students from different countries, and again, will depend on decisions of state and territory governments and how, you know, the initial pilot work. Look, we're giving it all necessary consideration, but yeah, at the moment, COVID-19 simply just won't allow us to make a call or even deliver a time frame.
I understand completely, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Dhiraj, you want to add anything?
Thanks, Robbie, for lobbying. You know, my daughter sitting next to me is really excited and telling you that, you know, she's waiting for the next flight. So maybe as part of the pilot project, you know, if Nepal Airlines again fly quickly with all these 1,600 students and more adding up, that'll be great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Honorable and His Excellency Peter Butt. I mean, you have been always inspiration to us. You have been great supporter of AAERI Nepal. We look forward to your continuous support in the days to come. Thanks, Robbie, for, you know, coming and, I know, maybe asking some questions and supporting me. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day and have a great evening in Sydney.